He found her tied to his fence, half frozen, half alive, and from that moment, his own silence would never save him again. The Wyoming wind cut like a knife that morning, carrying a scream sharp enough to wake the ghosts in his barn. Ethan Ward, the loneliest cowboy this side of Bitterroot Valley, froze mid-stride when he saw her, a young woman bound to his fence, wrists bleeding, lips split and blue from the frost. Her name, he would later learn, was Clara Wynne, the daughter of a drunk who had left her to die like livestock he could no longer afford to feed. Ethan had seen cruelty before. He'd worn it, buried it, thought it gone. But as he cut the ropes and saw the terror in her eyes, something deep and forgotten clawed its way back, a promise he'd once made to himself, never to let another soul suffer the way he had. When he carried her inside, the fire barely touched the cold between them. She didn't trust him. He didn't trust himself. Outside, the sky was turning the color of judgment. By nightfall, whispers from the town would brand her a sinner and him her keeper. But before the week was over, someone would ride to his gate, demanding to take her back. And Ethan would have to decide, how far will a broken man go to protect a stranger before he loses himself again? The cabin stood alone at the edge of the Bitterroot Valley, a lonely shape carved into the bones of winter. Inside, the fire cracked slow and uncertain, as if it too doubted it belonged there. Ethan Ward moved carefully through the small space, a man who'd spent years speaking more to ghosts than to people. He poured warm broth into a tin cup and set it near the hearth where Clara Wynne lay wrapped in a wool blanket, her skin still pale from the cold. She stirred but did not speak, her wide eyes darting from the rifle on the wall to the scar on Ethan's hand. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, slamming the shutters like a warning. The world beyond that door was cruel, and both of them knew it. Inside, a fragile silence stretched between them, not peace, but the uneasy calm between two survivors who hadn't yet decided if the other meant salvation or ruin. Ethan busied himself fixing the fire, refusing to meet her gaze. He didn't ask who she was or why her father had left her. Questions never saved anyone out here. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough as gravel. "You're safe now," he said. "For tonight, that's enough." But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe him, and maybe, neither did he. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the old fence where he'd found her. The place where everything had started, and where everything might still end. By the third sunrise, word had already reached the town of Ash Hollow. The quiet rancher up north had taken in a girl. Not just any girl, they said. The drunk's daughter, the one left for dead. Whispers rode faster than the wind in a town that fed on judgment. At the saloon, men spat tobacco and muttered that Ethan had finally lost his mind. At the church, women whispered behind their gloves that Clara Wynne wasn't worth saving. And at the general store, a widow named Mrs. Ellery raised her voice loud enough for God to hear, "A girl like that don't change. She only spreads the rot." That afternoon, Clara asked Ethan to ride into town for supplies. She wore one of his old shirts, tied with a rope at the waist, trying to look invisible. But silence is a cruel disguise. Every step through Main Street was a walk through shame she hadn't earned. When the insult came a handful of dust thrown at her boots, she froze. Ethan turned, his jaw tightening. "We're not here for trouble," he said. Mrs. Ellery's cane struck the ground. "Then you shouldn't have brought it." For a moment, Ethan's hand hovered near his gun, not for violence, but for restraint. He looked down at Clara, then back at the widow. "You'll answer to your own kind of hell, ma'am," he said quietly. They left in silence, but the stares followed. And somewhere deep inside, Clara understood. She wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting to be seen as human again. The sky had turned a bitter gray that morning, thick with the smell of snow and gun oil. Ethan was fixing the south fence when he heard the sound 3 horses, moving fast, not the kind of pace a friend keeps. He didn't reach for his rifle. Not yet. He just wiped the dirt from his hands and waited. The riders appeared over the ridge. Caleb Wynne, Clara's father, slumped in the saddle with a whiskey bottle in one hand and rage in the other. Behind him rode 2 men with hard eyes and heavier guns. "Ethan Ward," Caleb shouted, his voice slurred but his intent sharp. "I came for what's mine." Ethan didn't move. "You lost what was yours when you left her to die." Caleb's face twisted into something between a sneer and a smile. You think she's clean now? She's a curse, same as her mother. That girl ruins every man fool enough to care. Clara stepped out from the porch. She wasn't trembling anymore. Then I guess you made me that way, she said, voice steady as steel. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Caleb spat into the snow. You'll regret talking back, girl. Blood's blood, and mine runs through you. Ethan's hand dropped slowly to his belt, not a threat, but a promise. You take one more step, Caleb, he said softly, and I'll bury you under that oak behind the fence. That's not a threat, it's mercy. Caleb's companions shifted in their saddles. They weren't ready to die for a drunk's pride. After a long pause, Caleb laughed a dry, broken sound and turned his horse. You can have her, Ward. She ain't worth a grave anyway. He rode off, leaving the stench of whiskey and failure behind. Ethan watched him vanish over the ridge. Clara stood beside him, her hands trembling though she tried to hide it. You didn't have to protect me, she said quietly. I didn't, Ethan replied. I just stopped running from the kind of man I used to be. That night, the wind howled harder. The storm rolled in without mercy. Ethan added wood to the fire and checked the locks twice before sitting down. But peace is never a gift that lasts long on the frontier. Near midnight, the dogs barked. Then the distant thunder of hooves. Not 3 this time, 6, maybe more. Ethan's body tensed before his mind caught up. He grabbed his rifle, met Clara's frightened eyes. Basement crawl space, he said. Go, now. But Clara didn't move. They're here for me, aren't they? Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have to. The barn door blew open first splintered wood, curses, boots on frozen earth. Through the narrow window, Ethan saw the man leading them. A tall rider in a crimson duster, face half hidden beneath a black hat. Marshal Devlin, the man who bought debts and sold souls across the territory. Ethan's jaw clenched. Devlin had a reputation, the kind that made even lawmen step aside. Devlin dismounted slowly, scanning the dark yard like a man inspecting his own property. I heard you've been collecting strays, Ward, he said, voice smooth, almost polite. One of 'em happens to belong to me. Ethan stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. She's not yours. She's no one's. Devlin smiled, thin and cruel. You're wrong, cowboy. Her father signed a contract, $500 owed, settled by one daughter. That makes her collateral. That makes her mine. Clara's voice rose behind Ethan. I'm not a debt. I'm not a thing. Devlin looked up toward her voice, tipping his hat. You'll forgive me, miss, but in my business, there's no difference. The gunfire started before the words finished. Ethan fired first clean, deliberate, sending the nearest man spinning into the mud. Then came the answering volley. Wood splintered, glass shattered, the cabin shuddered under the roar. Clara ducked behind the hearth, her breath ragged. Get upstairs, Ethan shouted. Loft window. He followed her into the barn, bullets chewing through the walls. They took cover behind the feed crates, the smell of hay and blood thick in the air. Take this, he said, pressing his old revolver into her hand. 2 shots at a time. You aim low legs, not chest. You slow them down, not end them. You'll know when. The door crashed open. Boots pounded across the dirt. Shadows moved in the firelight, too many to count. Ethan moved like a man who'd done this too many times before. His rifle barked twice, one fell, then another. But the third reached the ladder, climbing toward Clara's hiding place. Her hands shook so hard she nearly dropped the revolver. Then she saw Ethan's blood hit the straw below, a deep red spreading fast across his sleeve. The world narrowed. The storm outside howled louder than her heartbeat. She raised the gun, both hands tight, and fired. The man's body fell backward, hitting the ground with a dull, final thud. For a long moment, there was only silence, broken by Ethan's voice, low and steady. You did what you had to. Tears burned her cheeks. I didn't want to kill him. No. Ethan's gaze met hers through the smoke. You didn't, he said. You chose to live. Outside, the last of Devlin's men retreated into the storm. Only their leader remained, still on horseback at the fence line, watching like a wolf, testing the edge of hunger. He tipped his hat. This isn't over, Ward. You're a dead man walking. Ethan didn't move, didn't speak. He simply lowered his rifle and stared him down until Devlin turned and rode into the storm, swallowed by snow and distance. When the echoes faded, Ethan finally sank to the ground, pressing a cloth to his arm. Clara knelt beside him, her hands still trembling. In the flicker of firelight, their faces were streaked with smoke, fear, and something else, the quiet, unspoken bond of two souls who had bled for the same kind of freedom. He looked at her and managed a weak smile. "I told you not to aim for the chest." She laughed through tears. "I didn't." Guess he fell on his own pride. The wind shifted. The storm began to pass, but both of them knew peace would not come easy after this night. Outside, the fence stood half broken, splintered where the ropes had once been. It was no longer a place of death. It was a boundary of choice. The storm broke before dawn, leaving behind a world-washed raw fences half buried in snow, hoofprints fading toward the mountains, and a silence so thick it made the cabin creak. Ethan sat by the window, his arm bound in linen, eyes fixed on the horizon like a man waiting for a ghost. Clara watched from across the room, wrapped in his flannel coat, her fingers tracing the revolver now lying on the table between them. She wanted to speak but didn't know which wound to name first, the one on his arm, or the one inside her chest. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You did what you had to," he said. "I killed a man," she whispered. "You survived one," he corrected. "There's a difference." The fire popped in the hearth, sending sparks into the low light. Outside, the land was still bleeding red beneath the snow. Later, while Ethan slept, Clara searched for bandages. That's when she found a small, carved box tucked beneath his bed. Inside lay an old photograph, a woman's face fading with time, and a folded letter stained with age. The handwriting was careful, almost tender. "To my son, Ethan. If you ever forget what love should feel like, find the wild asters near the creek. They bloom after the first frost, stubborn, foolish things that refuse to die." Beside the letter, a pressed flower, brittle, lavender-colored, fragile as memory. Clara's throat tightened. She turned the photo over. Written in faint ink, "Lydia Ward, taken by her husband's hand, 1859. Her breath caught. She looked at Ethan sleeping. The scar that ran from his collarbone down his arm, the same arm he'd used to shield her last night. The truth hit her like the wind off the ridge. He wasn't just protecting her. He was fighting the ghost of his father every time he drew his gun. When he woke, she was standing by the fire, holding the letter. "You lost her because of him," she said softly. Ethan's eyes flicked to the box, then to her face. No denial, just exhaustion. "Some debts never end, Clara. They just wait for another name." "Then why help me?" He hesitated. "Because the day I found you on that fence, I heard my mother's voice again, telling me not to let the world turn me cruel." Tears welled in her eyes. "You think you've failed her?" He shook his head slowly. "No. I think I finally listened." They didn't speak for a long time after that. The wind outside had softened to a whisper, carrying the faint smell of pine and smoke, the scent of survival. For a few weeks the valley rested. The townsfolk stopped whispering, or maybe they just ran out of things to say. Life returned to its slow rhythm, the kind where days bled into nights without ceremony. But peace, on the frontier, was never built to last. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Ethan was mending the fence when the sound returned. Hooves. Just one horse this time. A single rider, tall, wearing a crimson duster darkened by dust. Marshal Devlin. He stopped at the gate, dismounted, and removed his hat with a false politeness that chilled the air. "Came to finish what your bullets couldn't," Ethan said. Devlin smiled. "Not quite. I came to make a trade." Ethan's grip tightened on the hammer. "There's nothing left to trade." "Oh, there's always something," Devlin said, his tone like oil. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded contract, old, frayed, but still legible. $500 owed. One girl used as payment. It's all in writing. Signed by her father. He tossed the paper at Ethan's boots. "I don't care if you burn down half my crew. She belongs to me by law. And the law," he said with a smirk, "always collects." Ethan looked down at the paper, then up at the man who'd sent killers to his door. "I stopped believing in the law the day it called slavery a contract." Devlin's smile faded. "You think your conscience will save you?" You're no hero, Ward. You're just another fool with a gun and a guilty heart. Ethan raised his eyes, calm, steady. Maybe. But fools like me built this country while men like you sold it. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the last light catching the frost on their coats. Then Devlin drew his revolver. But Ethan didn't reach for his. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate. You want to take her, he said. You'll have to walk through me first. Devlin hesitated, the way some men do when they realize killing won't earn them power, only shame. Then, for the first time, he lowered his gun. You think you've won, Ward? Ethan didn't answer. This ain't over, Devlin hissed. The world forgets men like me, but it also forgets the women you die for. La. He mounted his horse, eyes dark as the coming storm, and rode off without another word. Ethan stood at the fence long after the dust settled. His breath rose in white clouds, his hand trembling around the paper. He knelt, struck a match, and watched the contract burn, ink curling into flame, law turning into ash. Behind him, Clara stepped out of the cabin, her hair catching the firelight. She watched the paper vanish into smoke, and said quietly, "Did that make it right?" Ethan shook his head. "No, but it made it ours." She came closer, standing beside him in the cold. "Then let's make something new." For the first time since the storm, he smiled. A tired, fragile smile, but real. The moon rose over the valley, pale and forgiving. In that light, two broken people stood on the land that had tried to bury them and chose, instead, to begin again. But far beyond the ridge, in the shadows where justice never reached, a man in a crimson coat watched the horizon and whispered, "This isn't over." Spring came late to the Bitterroot Valley that year, as if the land itself had to decide whether it was safe to breathe again. Snow melted slow, bleeding into the soil that had seen too much blood, too many ghosts. The cabin stood steady through it all, patched, scarred, but standing. So were they. Clara planted a garden behind the house, right along the fence where her wrists had once been bound. Rows of carrots, onions, and wild asters, the kind Ethan's mother had written about. She worked barefoot, hands in the dirt, humming low tunes she didn't remember learning. Ethan built beside her in silence. New railings, new posts, a new gate. He didn't say much, but every nail he drove into the wood was an apology to the world and a promise to her. When the neighbors began to appear, one by one, they didn't bring judgment this time. They brought seeds, fresh bread, a pot of coffee, even a set of mismatched chairs. Nobody said sorry for the gossip or the silence before, but they didn't have to. Redemption has a language of its own, and it's written in gestures, not words. One evening, Ethan returned from town carrying something wrapped in cloth. He set it on the porch and stepped back awkwardly. Clara unwrapped it to find a hand-carved chair, sturdy and smooth, her initials, C.W., etched across the top rail. She traced the letters with trembling fingers. "You made this?" He nodded. "Figured you needed a place to rest." The sun was sinking low, turning the fields gold. She sat down slowly, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath her palms. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan leaned against the post, pretending not to look. "It's solid, like you." She smiled at that, a soft, private smile that reached her eyes. The wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, life, returning to the places death had touched. A moment passed before she spoke again, her voice quiet but sure. "If I changed my last name, would you think it foolish?" He looked at her then, fully, his green eyes steady in the light. "Depends what you'd change it to." She hesitated, the corner of her mouth curling. "Maybe yours." Ethan froze, the hammer in his hand dropping softly to the ground. For a long heartbeat, neither of them breathed. Then he said, plain as water, "Then I'd take yours, just to keep things fair." Clara laughed, a small, startled sound that startled even the birds from the eaves. Ethan's face went red under the brim of his hat. But he smiled too, that rare kind of smile that belongs only to men who thought they'd never smile again. They didn't speak of love that night. They didn't need to. Love had already built itself, one act of quiet courage at a time. By midsummer, the garden bloomed thick with color. Children from town ran along the fence, laughing, chasing the wind. The same fence that once marked pain now guarded something sacred home. That evening, Clara stood by the doorway, watching Ethan mend the last bit of roof. "You're not going to stop fixing things, are you?" she teased. He grinned. "Not if I can help it. The world's still got too many broken pieces." She stepped closer, slipping her hand into his. "Then maybe we'll fix them together." And just like that, without vows or witnesses, they sealed the only promise that mattered. Outside, the sunset drifted low over the valley, painting the wild asters in gold. Clara watched them bloom and thought of the dried flower in Ethan's wooden box, the one that had survived every storm, every flame. As the wind whispered through the eaves, she spoke softly, almost to herself. "Even what the fire couldn't burn still grows again." Ethan tightened his hand around hers, his eyes calmer than ever. The storm had passed, but their story, it had just begun. The wedding wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. Just a few faces from town, a preacher too old to stand without his cane, and the smell of wild sage drifting in the wind. Beneath the oak tree that marked so much of their story, the threats, the promises, the silence, Ethan Ward stood waiting in a clean shirt, his hat pressed to his chest. Then came Clara Wynne, barefoot, wearing a simple white dress she'd sewn herself. No veil, no jewelry, just a ribbon in her hair and the look of someone who had already survived her vows long before speaking them. As she walked down the dusty path, the townsfolk watched in a hush that felt like reverence. The same mouths that once whispered sin now spoke only blessings. When she reached him, Ethan smiled, not wide, not proud, but enough. "You sure about this?" he murmured. Clara's eyes glimmered. "I was sure the moment you untied that rope." The preacher said his words, short and kind. Ethan slipped a simple ring, shaped from a horseshoe nail, onto her finger. It wasn't fancy, just honest. "You came here by choice," he said quietly, "and I'm proud to stand beside that choice." The wind answered with a soft gust, carrying their words across the open plain like a hymn. Later, as twilight fell, Ethan lit a small fire behind the barn. He held in his hand the last remnant of the old debt, Caleb Wynne's contract, weathered and cruel. He looked at Clara once, then tossed it into the flame. The paper curled, turned black, and rose into the night sky like a spirit set free. Clara leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. The reflection of the fire danced in her eyes. "What do you think happens to all that pain?" she asked softly. Ethan watched the ashes lift into the wind. "It becomes part of the land," he said, "so something better can grow." Above them, the stars began to appear, quiet, patient, eternal. In the distance, the Bitterroot Valley shimmered under the moonlight, a world both cruel and kind. And as the fire faded to embers, Ethan reached for her hand, whispering the words he'd never said aloud until now. "We made it, Clara, we really made it." She smiled. "Then let's keep making it. If this story touched something in you, if you believe that even in dust and silence, love still speaks, then saddle up and ride with us again." Subscribe to the Western Trail for more tales of redemption, courage, and the kind of love that survives the frontier.